There we go. Hi,
Hi,
JC.
Mona. Hello. Hello.
Kamusta?
Nice to see you. Okay
You're,
lang.
ano naman, fangirling naman ako. Thank you so much for accepting me.
Ako actually ang nagpa-fanboy sa'yo. Napakasikat mo na dito sa TikTok.
Oh, hanggang TikTok lang. Pero, JC, for those of you who don't know, ngayon lang kami nag-usap ni JC like with voice. Usually,
Yes.
lang kami, nag-Twitter lang kami. We just talk on Twitter. Ang hinga na, may mga nagpapamod. Hindi ko alam kung paano magpamod. Hindi ko alam kung paano kayo gawing moderator. Pasensya po. Pasensya, biscuits. Sorry, JC, this is my first time doing a live. So please bear with me. I am honored that you said yes to my very first live. So JC,
Oo naman.
question. Anong batch ka nag-graduate sa UP? Anong year? Undergrad.
Sasabihin ko ba, 2009. More than a decade ago na.
Nakita ba ito kilay ko?
Hindi, parang di naman nagkakalayo sa 2009. Oo, parang magkasunod lang.
Baby ka pa. Nanganak ka na ba noon?
1980, hindi pa. 89 ako.
Ayun. Pero biro mo nung nag-graduate ako, kakapanganak mo pa lang. Pero, pareho natin naging teacher si Solita Monsod.
Ayun nga. And actually, she's still
pero
at
ako,
it,
Diba? So, ang saya, diba? Parang teacher mo siya dati, tapos ngayon colleague mo na siya.
Kaya, oo
diba?
nga, actually, oo. Tsaka as in, talagang napaka-iconic niya. Even yung mga estudyante, laging in demand pa rin talaga ang mga klase niya eh. So, that's a testament to how good she is as a professor.
Yeah. Kasi nga showbiz na siya ngayon. Pero, nung panahon ko, hindi pa siya showbiz. In the 80s. Kasi nga, I'm not an econ major nung undergrad. So, business major ako. And we only had one econ subject. She would finish her smoke. Tapos, pagpasok niya, meron siyang iced tea palagi sa papasok ng auditorium. Pagkatapos yung mga lalaki, it was like at 8 o'clock in the morning, sasabihin nila, uy, ano yata? Beer yata yung dala ni ma'am. Parang gano'n. Iniintriga pa siya. Pero kasi nga, she was so cool in the eyes of so many, di ba?
Oo nga. Maraming
pero
urban
ikaw,
legends kung ano yung laman nung kanyang mug.
Yung kanyang drink. So ikaw, ano yung Solita Monsod story?
Well, actually, Mona, naging prof ko siya way back 2008 pa eh. I took a course under her, yung Econ 191, Development Economics. And it so happens na yun talaga ang kanyang specialty kasi being a former NEDA Director General, so ang dami niyang insights when it comes to development. And even yung mga historical chika, na porque for example yung negotiations natin with the IMF back in the mid-80s, parang she's privy to that eh. So parang talagang in a way relic siya nung panahon yun na parang primary source siya na tanong mo na lang sa kanya kung ano bang nangyari noon, 'di ba? And talagang saludo talaga ako sa kanya.
Oo. Meron pang isang student ni si Dr. Laines is also in the room, and Econ 11 professor din niya si Solita Monsod. Ito pa, isa pa question. Para tayong
Chika minute.
Boy, abunda ako tonight. Bakit economics? Why did you study economics?
Well, actually, Mona, accident nga siya eh, kasi it was really meant to be just a pre-law. Kasi yung mom and dad ko, yung foster mom and dad ko, parehas silang lawyers. And it was really either law for me or medicine kasi yung biological mom and dad ko naman, doctor and nurse. So, sabi ko, parang siguro mas feel ko yung law, mas nagkaroon silang impact sa akin. So, sige, econ muna as a pre-law. Tapos later on, actually, I entered UP Law right after undergrad. Nag-aral ako ng law for 1 year. Pero hindi ko nagustuhan mo na hindi ko na-enjoy masyado. Sabi ko, nasaan yung math? Nasaan yung numbers? Oddly enough, hinahanap ko yung numbers. So, ayun, parang since then, parang sabi ko, nabaligtad, di ba? So, I found my way back to Econ. Tapos, yun na, master's and PhD. Pero it was by no means a straightforward career decision for me.
I wanted to be an accountant early, like when I was younger. Kasi I thought there was money in it. Hindi ko pa alam ang mga buhay nun. Pero anyway,
Little
ako
did you
naman,
know.
parang kailangan ko ng something creative, kailangan ko ng, both left brain, right brain. Numbers are still okay with me. Kung kaya ko, it calms me. Tapos, ako, my master's was applied economics. Only because I felt my business track naman, parang masyado siyang micro. Parang I wanted a bigger picture. So, ayun. Parang hindi ako na in love sa kanya to the point na I practice it. It came in handy kapag I need to do projections for, kasi nag-sales ako eh. So, when I did projection for sales, ganun. Pero not talagang love na love. Pero ikaw, love na love mo.
Oo, actually, parang, pero it was a realization eh. Pero ikaw, sa case mo na parang fast forward to today, paano ka nag-end up with genealogy? Paano ka napasok sa ganong klaseng, I mean, how did you come to that field?
Ako, and I've shared this with people before din, na I started kasi I wanted to make a unique Christmas gift for my husband's side of the family. So sabi ko, research ko yung history ng family nila. Kasi matatanda na sila. And they always have these amazing stories. So I documented that. Tapos I went back and validated. It was a rabbit hole. Magaling pala ako mag-research. Yun yung ko lang na-discover na, I have this skill na you know how to search, it clicks in your head kung saan ka hahanap ng data, it clicks in your head kung ano yung search word na gagamitin mo. Pero yung history, parang I had a better appreciation for history because I was studying it in the context of families. Na parang ano ba yung ginagawa nila? Actually, ikaw nga Punongbayan. Yung surname mo, of course, is it's a nice surname. Sa totoo lang. As in, ang taray ng surname mo.
Pampolitiko, di ba, Mona?
Of your adoptive family mo ba? Or yung bio parents mo nagbigay sa ng surname?
Yung biological dad ko, siya ang Punongbayan talaga. Ang mga Punongbayan mo mga taga Bulacan eh. Pero actually, meron din mga Punongbayan sa Visayas, some parts of Visayas. Pero for the most part, I think nasa Central Luzon eh. I think obvious naman na as in Tagalog na Tagalog, di ba? Punong-bayan, pampolitiko. In fact.
Ano siya? Di ba? Talagang bossing yung surname. Masaya eh, di ba? It's fun to, ikaw, masaya kang i-research dahil maganda yung last name.
Alam mo, actually, Mona, interesado din ako somehow sa genealogy kasi, pero ang mas na-research ko, yung sa foster mom and dad ko kasi they're both senior citizens. And dadami din nilang kwento sa mga relatives nila, mga kanununuan. So I think about a decade ago, meron yung app na genealogy app na tinry ko siyang i-map yung family tree namin. And somehow nakaabot ako dun sa great-great-great-grandfather. Alam mo, nakalimutan. Ancestry ba yun or something? Nakalimutan ko na
Ancestry.com or Jenny.com.
Parang ganun eh.
Pero masaya dyan yung makahanap ka ng document.
Oo, actually.
Oo. JC game ha.
Sige.
Mag-usapang mag-usapang Ginto at saka Salapi.
Go.
Okay. So, first off, one of my learnings after I did Italiano Gold story was there was a lot of confusion kung bakit tayo may ginto. Bakit ba ang Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas merong mga gold bars na may nakatatak na BSP?
Yes, well actually Mona, ang fascinating din talaga nung economic history niyan And yung gold reserves ng Bangko Sentral actually it's kind of a relic nung gold standard in the early 20th century. Kasi dati Mona, ang pera natin, ang piso ay nakatali doon sa value ng ginto. And the same goes for many other currencies around the world. So in other words, kung meron kang certain amount of pesos, pwede mong ipalit yun sa certain amount of gold. And this was the case, for example, sa US dollar and other currencies. Pero naging hindi sustainable kasi yung gold standard eh. Kasi for example, during wars, kasi parang kung nakatali sa gold yung pera mo, ibig sabihin parang fixed lang yung money supply mo. So for example, in cases like wars, kung saan kailangan mo ng substantial resources to pay for the war effort, etc., hindi ka maka-amass ng enough currency to pay for those expenses. So what many countries did was they abandoned the gold standard during those times of wars. And then later on, kapag natapos na yung war, sa kanila ibabalik yung ganong klaseng sistema na gold standard. Pero parang ang laro dito muna ay kailangan lahat ng bansa sumusunod sa ganong klaseng gold standard eh. Pero somehow, some countries like the US, the UK, hindi nila sinusunod at times, so hindi naging sustainable yung ganong sistema.
Yun nga parang nakatali yung money in circulation to the amount of gold that you have in your central bank. Sa States, parang Fort Knox yan, di ba? Tama ba?
Correct.
Na sila yung pinakamaraming gold?
Hiwa-hiwalay yung yung pag-store niya sa mga vaults eh. Hindi lang sa Fort Knox kundi sa iba't ibang branches ng Federal Reserve. Yun yung tawag sa Central Bank ng US Federal Reserve eh. Pero yun, since the gold standard, hindi na kasing importante yung gold eh sa international finance kasi in the time of Nixon, inabandon completely yung gold standard kasi nga ay hindi ito sustainable at in many cases ay nagdudulot ito ng inflation or deflation. Depende kasi hindi sumasabay yung amount of gold dun sa pag-grow ng mga ekonomiya. So, napaka-volatile ng inflation because of the gold standard. So, in 1971, during the time of Nixon, ay inabandon na ito completely. So from the gold standard ay naging fiat currency. It was the international finance system mona kasi after World War II and then up until 1971 parang ang naging compromise ng mga bansa ay itinali na lang yung values ng currency dun sa dollar. Kasi ang nangyari ay after World War II nakapag-amass yung US ng parang halos virtually all the gold reserves ay nasa US or a substantial part of it. So basically, yung value ng dollar nakatali dun sa ginto nila. And then ang ginawa na lang ng ibang bansa, itinali nila yung kanilang currencies dun sa dollar para mas madali, para hindi na sa gold nakatali. Pero hindi ito naging sustainable din up until 1971. Yun na nga, parang naging fiat currency na tayong lahat na naniniwala merong value yung pera. So yung fiat currency ay ibig sabihin yung pera natin ngayon ay hindi na nakatali doon sa value ng ginto, kundi ang compromise ay naniniwala tayong lahat na may value itong pera na ito at the same goes for all other currencies. So, hindi necessarily na mapapapalitan mo na ng ginto yung pera mo. Pero may value yun dahil naniniwala tayong lahat na may value yun. So, ganun yung sistema natin up until now.
Talagang fake
basically,
ang ginagamit natin.
Oo.
Bakit halimbawa, ba't hindi na tayo mag-print ng pera? Di ba? Para dumami ang pera ng lahat.
Correct. Correct. Isang tempting na proposition yan, and maraming bansa mo na ang ginawa yan precisely in some episodes of history. For example, yung recent examples, yung sa Zimbabwe around 2008, and then sa Venezuela in the past few years. Kapag merong crisis o merong significant expense yung gobyerno, ay print na lang ng print ng pera. Pero hindi ito sustainable muna kasi nagdudulot ito ng hyperinflation. Ibig sabihin ay masyadong bumibilis ang pagtaas ng presyo ng mga bilihin kapag masyadong mabilis ang money growth. Kasi ang nangyari ay ang daming mga pera, so habang dumadami ang pera, ibig sabihin yung value ng bawat isa ay paliit ng paliit. At ang nangyari doon ay tumataas ang presyo ng mga bilihin at hindi yun sustainable, ang daming naghihirap. Ang closest experience natin dyan muna yung sa Japanese period, kung saan during the Japanese occupation,
diba?
Correct. Yung Mickey Mouse money na tinatawag, kung saan to buy the simplest commodities ay kailangan bayong-bayong yung dala mong pera. Kasi nag-introduce sila nung pera nila, pero there was so much of it na it's as if nag-print tayo ng andaming pera and then boom, hyperinflation. So hindi siya sustainable, although it's quite tempting, pero yun, hindi na siya ginagawa ng mga bansa ngayon, at least most countries.
And for those na who've never had to study economics, parang everything should be balanced whenever dumami yung supply of money in the market, meron yan effect in other parts of the equation. Or kapag umutang
Correct.
tayo ng masyadong marami, may effect at may effect yan. So parang kapag bumaba ito, tataas yan. Pag tumaas yan, bababa ito. So gano'n, parang it's a balancing act. Kaya kailangan meron tayong mga magagaling na ekonomista para gumanda ang kabuhayan natin. So, JC, sino kayo nag-determine nung value of money? Sabi mo, we're pegged to the dollar. Na yun yung how we determine how much our money is. But that's always relative. So kung halimbawa sa Pilipinas, paano determine kung magkano yung nabibili ng 100 pesos mo? Ano yung determinants nun?
That's another good question, Mona, no? And merong dalawang paraan para malaman natin yung value ng currency. Ang isang paraan doon ay, for example, meron tayong tinatawag na fixed exchange rate regime kung saan yung gobyerno mismo yung nagsiset ng exchange rate. And in fact, this was the case right after World War II here in the Philippines. At tumagal siya up until the 1960s doong pumasok si Marcos. Dati after World War II, ang exchange rate ay 2 pesos kada $1. So napakalakas ng piso compared sa dollar. Pero over time ay bumaba ang value noon, hindi siya naging sustainable. Ang nangyari kasi, well, ito actually ang habang kwento nito pero tatry kong paikliin. Nung panahon kasi ni Marcos, TikTok version 15 seconds. So ang nangyari ay ang trade policy kasi ni Marcos ay mag-import tayo na mag-import para lumaki yung domestic industry. Pero para maging mura yung imports ay kailangan malakas yung ating currency. So yung minana ni Marcos na fixed exchange rate na nasa bandang 3 pesos nga siya nung pumasok na siya Maintain yun para para lumakas yung domestic industry natin. The idea being kapag malakas na yung domestic industry ay makakapag-export na sila ng maraming goods abroad at kikita tayo ng maraming dolyar out of that. Pero ang nangyari ay actually hindi naging sustainable yung ganong klaseng polisiya kasi after all, hindi naman talaga nag-mature yung mga domestic industries na yun. At so, dumating sa punto, at nakakaubusan ng dollars dahil doon sa masyadong malakas na piso. So, ang nangyari ay nagkaroon tayo ng currency crisis by 1970. After the first term of President Marcos, halos naubos din yung reserves natin at that time. So, wala tayong pambayad ng ating mga imports, wala tayong pambayad ng ating mga utang. So ang nangyari ay the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, had to come into the country and implement a stabilization program. Meaning, sila lang yung makakapagpautang sa atin ng enough dollars to pay for our obligations, pero kailangan mag-implement ni Marcos ng mga polisiya to fix the economy that he had mismanaged back then. And the thing is, ang isang important condition is, kailangan i-devalue yung currency kasi masyadong malakas. So, kailangan siyang pababain in value para hindi magkaubusan ng dollars. And this same problem, in fact, Mona, recurred in the 80s in a much more parang sinister way kasi nandiyan yung corruption, crony capitalism, nagkaubusan ulit ng dollars basically nung 1980s. And again, the IMF had to come into the country to fix the situation.
Yeah, and yon for me, JC, when I was in school, I was dealing with that as news. So, parang we were discussing it in class. Na bakit napaka-importante ba ng IMF? Bakit ba nila dinedictate yung exchange rate natin? Bakit nila dinedictate how much we can borrow? Bakit nila dinedictate? So ano bang power sa atin ng IMF? Bakit natin sila kailangan? At bakit historically they have been looming over us? Ano bang relevance nila?
Well, yung IMF, isa yan sa mga institutions apart from the World Bank na itinatag right after World War II in the aftermath nga nung gera, World War II. So anong nangyari ay kailangan i-fix kasi yung finances, especially yung mga war reparations, and then maraming mga bansa ang nagkaproblema sa kanilang currencies as well as sa kanilang finances. So parang there had to be an international system by which countries could pitch in and somehow help one another, especially yung mga may resources to basically help yung mga walang resources. And since then, naging takbuhan na ng mga bansa na mayroong currency crisis yung IMF kapag nagkakaubusan sila ng dollars, etc. And somehow, nagiging effective naman yung stabilization policies ng IMF. And in fact, that was the case in the Philippine context, na kung hindi nag-intervene yung IMF, ay siguro lalo pang lumala yung currency crisis natin in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it's parang nagkataon lang na nandyan sila, meron silang significant funds by which they can lend to countries that are in trouble, and in many cases ay effective naman siya. Pero of course, nagkaroon ng bad rap din kasi merong conditionalities yung kanilang pera. Hindi sila basta-basta magbibigay ng pera, kailangan merong makapag-satisfy ng conditions ang mga gobyerno to fix their respective economies. Pero more often than not ay merong negative connotations yung ganun, na foreign intervention, na parang nanghihimasok yung foreigners. So, ayun, it's a mix of good and bad.
I think what people don't realize is, kumbaga yun nga, parang sinister sila, evil. Pero actually, hindi parang larger scale of a regular bank. Diba? Para lang regular yan. Para lang, pag magpapa-credit card ka, may mga conditions din na kailangan kang ma-meet. Diba?
Correct. And in the case of Marcos kasi, Mona, nagka-problema din talaga na parang I can't put this any other way. Parang si Marcos talaga yung nagdulot din naman nung crisis, currency crisis natin in the 70s and 80s. Na parang we didn't have to get that IMF stabilization program kung inayos lang sana yung pag-manage do sa ekonomiya. Pero ang nangyari kasi, Mona, ay maraming nahaluan na ng politika yung policies ni Marcos. For example, yung exchange rate mismo, maraming tumututol din dun sa pag-devalue ng piso. Kasi isa siyang threat dun sa mga industries na mga cronies na hindi na magiging sustainable, hindi na sila ma-envelop or maproprotektuhan mula sa international competition. So it was a threat to them, and sumunod si Marcos sa ganong klaseng parang motivation ng mga cronies and among many other policies, kaya tumagal yung crisis.
Agree. A lot of people would say, bakit after Marcos kailangan natin ibenta yung mga assets ng company? Bakit, di ba? Ba't pinamigay natin? Bakit natin i-privatize? Kasi nga may utang po tayo, mga kapatid. Kailangan mag-garage sale. So, privatization, liberalization of industries, yan po ang resulta para gumanda yung ekonomiya. Kasi kung may monopoly, wala pong foreign investors na magpapasok ng bagong kapital na kailangan nung industry at ng bansa para umunlad, para makabayad utang. So, di ba? Ano lang yan bayad utang mechanism yan. Para lang tayo yan. Pag kinakapos tayo, mag-garage sale tayo, we have to liquidate, benta mo cellphone mo, benta mo yung ganyan. Kasi nga, kailangan ng pambayad utang. So, ganun lang po, diba?
Gusto ko yung term mo, Mona, na garage sale. And in fact, ganun nga yung nangyari. Maraming mga public corporations na maraming assets na hindi naman kailangan or hindi naman productive or efficient. So, better to let go of that na lang. And Marcos himself actually signed presidential decree ba yun or executive order to that effect, na parang even before Cory came in, ay nilay down na ni Marcos yung groundwork for the liquidation of many of those useless assets.
There was no parang nefarious plan about it. It was really just a way to get the money back. Nagkataon lang, medyo ang natamaan, I think, are also a lot of the cronies who were holding on to monopolies, who were holding on to certain protected industries. Kaya parang nagmukhang, it didn't look nice in the eyes of others. Pero sa totoo lang, it just really made sense. Ako nga, my masteral thesis was about the liberalization of the telecoms industry in the mid-1990s. And yun, it was actually a profound example of how things got better. Kasi nga, before, PLDT, my dad was from PLDT. Talaga, it was a protected industry na hindi ka pwede magpagawa ng telepono kung hindi ka dadaan sa PLDT. Pag gusto mo ng telepono, maghihintay ka ng 2 taon para sa isang landline. When the industry was liberalized in 1990, super daming players. As in, biglang dumami yung infrastructure, even though it wasn't sustainable. Eventually, parang nag-self-regulate yung industry. Kasi nga, to make telecoms industry work, it really doesn't make sense na masyadong maraming players. Siguro mga 1, 2, 3
Correct. Kasi natural monopoly siya.
Players. Correct. Ako kasi I'm a believer in free economies. 'Di ba parang 'di ba nung martial law mababa ang presyo ng gasolina. 'Di ba yung martial law mababa ang presyo nito. Marami silang mga primary goods na sinasabi. And in many cases, there was a regulation fund ina-establish ang gobyerno to kind of manage the up and down of those commodities to a point na it became a subject for corruption.
Correct.
Kasi nga, parang Coco Levy yan na parang, ang daming pera nito na it's supposed to help things good. Pero ano nangyari? People dipped into it then. So, to a certain degree, the intention was good para to help regulate a certain commodity, pero dahil na rin sa kahinaan natin, hindi nila na sustain yon. So JC, I know that you recently released a paper, a report, an amazing study on martial law, the economics during the martial law time. Kwento mo naman sa amin, i-plug mo.
Thank you, Mona. Well, actually, 2018 pa namin yung sinulat, Mona. And pinesent din namin yun sa UP School of Economics sa isang Friday seminar. And super blockbuster noon na parang yung auditorium na puno for the first time for a Friday seminar. Ang dami talagang interesado sa ganitong klaseng usapin. Pero ang summary noon, kung kaya kong gawin in a TikTok version, ay basically paano ba? Talagang nasira ekonomiya nung panahon ni Marcos. And ito ay dahil sa maraming dahilan, doon sa trade policies, doon sa exchange rate policies, yung crony capitalism, yung pagbuwag sa mga democratic institutions, all of that somehow culminated doon sa decline . And yung sinasabi na growth during that time, kasi aminin natin na nung 70s and merong mga years nung 1970s na mataas yung growth. In fact, in the early 70s, sa first half, merong 2 years na 8% yung annual growth, which is the highest growth rates in our recent history. Pero kailangan mong ibilang yung pagdapa din ng ekonomiya noong 1984 and 1985 when the economy slumped by 7% for 2 consecutive years. Yun ang pinakamalalang recession or economic crisis ng Pilipinas since World War II. And in fact, itong COVID-19 pandemic natin, Mona, dumapa yung ekonomiya natin by 10% noong 2020. Pero dati naman, noong mid-80s, wala namang pandemic . Ang nangyari ay dahil sa isang diktador na mali-mali yung economic policies, pagbilangin mo yung 2 years na yon, 84 and 85, 14% yung dinapa ng ekonomiya natin. And in that sense, pwede mong sabihin na yung pa rin yung pinakamalalang economic crisis natin since World War II. And kapag when you drill down doon sa GDP per capita naman, kung hatiin natin yung GDP sa lahat ng Pilipino, magkano yung hati natin sa income ng bansa, lumalabas na dumapa siya ng mas malaki pa by almost 10% nung 84 and 85. And hindi natin na-recover muna yung income natin noong 1982 up until 2003. More than 2 decades later. So, isipin mo na lang kung tuloy-tuloy sana yung pagtaas ng ekonomiya natin nung 70s, nasa na kaya tayo ngayon? Siguro nasa 3 or 4 times na mas malaki yung national income natin sa ngayon. So, tinatawag din yun na lost decades of development, and it was really a lot of missed opportunities na sana mas malago pa sana ekonomiya natin ngayon. I think yun yung buod nun.
And I think there are also a lot of people who say, kung sure, sige, masama na yung di ba, the 70s and the 80s were bad. Mga sabi natin 15 years, sabihin natin. Bakit hindi na-improve nung sumunod na administration, yung pangalawang administration? Ako my take on that, kasi pero mo yun, almost 20 years ka na nasira yung economy mo. Hindi yan magba-bounce back immediately. There are certain behaviors, there are certain reputations that have to be repaired over the same amount of time. And so So tama nga, mga 2000s talaga babalik yan. In fact, actually, yung nabasa ko like in the 90s, sometimes sa mga reports, minsan talagang PR, di ba? Parang pini-PR natin yung sarili natin. Talagang rah-rah-rah, development plan, tiger economy. So talagang ang dami nating pini-PR kasi nga, we were recovering from such a bad time. So, any leader, kahit na sino yung nakaupo nun after, it won't be easy for them from an economic standpoint.
Yes.
Kasi nga, there are a lot of problems that have to be fixed. Talagang it will take time. Ang wish na lang natin, and we need to have this conversation kasi we're going into another slump in our economy, is we have to select the right people to make sure na it doesn't get worse. Kasi it can get worse if things aren't handled properly. So, ito JC question. From a macro standpoint, sino ba nagmamanage ng economy natin? Sino ba yon? Presidente ba yon? Sino ba talaga yung mga main drivers of growth? If you look at responsibility, is it just the president? It's a cabinet?
Yes, well, actually Mona, kung tingnan natin ano yung data, saan ba nanggagaling ang growth ng Pilipinas? And for the longest time, ang driver talaga ng Pilipinas ay consumption growth. Ito yung pagkonsumo ng mga ordinaryong households and individuals on an everyday basis. Yung pagpunta natin sa mall, sa mga tiangge, sa mga restaurant, etc. Ito talaga ang driver ng ating ekonomiya. Sumusunod lang yung investment spending. Ito yung mga namumuhunan ng mga businesses, mga nag-e-expand ng mga negosyo, mga nagre-reinvest ng kanilang earnings. And then yung government itself ay in a way ay nagko-contribute din sa economic growth, especially now in the pandemic na bumaba talaga yung activity ng private sector and yung gobyerno na lang yung natira. Talagang nag-i-spend in a massive scale. Pero ang impluwensya ng gobyerno ay pumapasok din doon sa ano yung mga batas, ano yung mga policies, ano yung regulations na binubuo nila to spur or encourage economic activity in the private sector. So dito pumapasok, for example, yung economic managers, quote-unquote, na tinatawag, yung mga head ng NEDA, DOF, BSP, DTI, etc., na nanghihimok sa mga investors from abroad na pumasok sa ating bansa para tumaas pa yung foreign direct investments. Or, for example, yung Bangko Sentral, in a way, meron din siyang impluwensya sa ekonomiya. Ang kanyang primary goal ay gawing stable ang presyo ng mga bilihin para hindi mataas masyado yung inflation. Ang target niya actually Mona nasa 3% on an annual basis, plus or minus 1%. So mga 2 hanggang 4% yung ginagalawan niya. Ayaw niya na masyadong mababa yung inflation below 2%. Ayaw din niya na masyadong mataas yung inflation above 4%. Dapat nasa parang Goldilocks zone siya at hindi siya lalabas doon. So it does many kinds of policies to maintain that stable inflation kasi ayaw natin na masyadong wild yung inflation rate kasi ang pinakamataas na inflation ng record happened in 1984. During the economic crisis, pumalo siya ng 50%. And during some months, I'm sure, siguro pwede ka magkwento niyan, paano siya nararamdaman on a tangible basis, di ba? May mga buwan pa na 60% yung inflation at that time. So, we've graduated from that kind of wild inflation rate. Naging stable na ekonomiya natin. So, ganun. Parang may mga paraan para i-influensya yung ekonomiya to move in the right direction, to make growth stable, to make inflation stable. Pero hindi lahat pwedeng gawin ng gobyerno eh. Kailangan din talaga stable yung economic environment. Yun na yung the least it can do to provide an environment that is conducive for investments and economic activity. And then the rest will follow. Growth will follow.
The term oligarchy. There are different types of economies. Oligarchies are economies or administrations that are tyrannical in nature, run by the rich. Are we run by oligarchs?
Well, I think mas applicable yung oligarchy nung panahon ni Marcos, I would say. Kasi at that time, talagang nag-expand yung influensya ni Marcos sa private sector kasi yung cronies niya ay itinalaga niya sa iba't ibang mga klaseng industriya, in power, in water, in all sorts of businesses. talagang si Imelda, I remember meron siyang interview sa Inquirer back in 1998. Sinabi niya, we practically own the Philippines. Tapos nagbanggit siya ng huge list of sectors kung saan kinokontrol daw nila yung ekonomiya and through the cronies. So I guess yun yung talagang masasabi natin na oligarchy. Pero ngayon, nakikita natin, of course, nandiyan pa rin yung remnants of that kind of crony capitalism. Buhay pa yung ibang cronies, yung mga businesses that they have set up are still in existence. And mataas pa rin yung income inequality sa ating bansa na talagang yung concentration of wealth ay nandiyan pa rin. And of course, yung big business ay nandiyan pa rin. Pero at the same time, I would say na hindi na ganoon, wala nang ganong klaseng crony capitalism to the extent that it happened during martial law. And somehow yung growth ay nararamdaman din ng hindi na lang mayaman ang nag-grow ngayon sa Pilipinas muna. If you look at the numbers, yung middle class ay lumalaki significantly. Yung bilang ng may hirap ay lumiliit over time, except nitong week na to, lumabas lang na tumaas ulit yung poverty from 2018 to 2021 because of the pandemic. But otherwise, lumiliit, kumukonti yung mga mahihirap sa Pilipinas. So in a way, nag-i-improve din in terms of inequality, in terms of growth, in terms of the distribution of resources. So, wala na tayo doon sa panahon na talagang oligarkiya ang Pilipinas. I think that would apply more doon sa martial law years.
Ako, I agree. Although ngayon, parang ginagamit yung term na oligarch as pang-put down ng mga taong mayayaman. And hindi naman po dahil mayaman siya, dahil may-ari siya ng kumpanya or marami siyang shares doon sa kumpanyang yon, ay oligarch na siya. Hindi po ganun ang oligarchy. So, kailangan po tayong pumunta sa internet at i-search po natin kung anong ibig sabihin ng oligarchy.
Yeah.
Kung pwede po sana. O, diba? So, yun. I was seeing questions kanina. Maraming salamat po for joining us in this discussion. Remember that we focus on economics. Kasi nga, andito si JC Punongbayan, di ba? Yun ang superpower ni JC. So, yun ang pinag-uusapan natin. Pero syempre, di lang po yun ang nangyari. If you want to talk about something else, let me know. Baka pwede nating pag-usapan sa susunod. O parang may susunod pa ako. Hindi ko nga alam eh. Kasi nga,
go!
dapat ka-level ni JC Punongbayan yung makakausap natin para siguradong dependability. Yung pinagsasasabi, ganun na lang. Let's open naman. Let's open the floor to questions.
May isa dito muna, podcast daw. Gawa ka daw ng podcast.
Tama din. Daming trabaho pag podcast.
Oo nga, matrabaho siya.
Masyadong hindi ko kaya. And this is something that somebody also shared. Bakit ang Japan super devalued ang pera nila? 'Di ba? Parang 1,000 yen will not buy you a lot. Super devalued ang pera nila. Pero ang economy nila okay lang.
Yes, oo. Well, actually Mona, ang isang fact ay hindi talaga correlated yung level of development tsaka yung lakas ng isang currency. For example, nakita natin in the middle of the pandemic, yung piso compared to the dollar ay lumakas pa yung piso compared to the dollar. Pero that was in fact because of the weak importation na nangyayari because of the pandemic. So, hindi siya correlated muna And in the case of Japan, is a more of a historical happenstance Pero nakita man naman natin na bagamat bumaba yung ekonomiya ng Japan after World War II, because of the very high saving rate, ay mabilis silang nakabangon. And yung ganong klaseng pagbangon is not necessarily reflected in the exchange rate. So, kapag gusto mong tignan yung lakas ng ekonomiya, yung exchange rate is not a very good indicator of that.
Meron nagtanong dito, JC. I know you did a story on Malampaya for Rappler. Ano ka daw? Magkwento ka tungkol sa Malampaya. Ano ba nangyayari sa Malampaya?
Chika minute. Baka masampan ako ng libel. Baka masampan ako ng libel muna ni Secretary Cusi. Hindi, pero hindi, okay lang. Actually, ang development doon muna ay parang yung TNOC ay basically government corporation na involved doon sa deal parang hindi na siya masyadong rarara doon sa deal with Dennis Uy. Parang binabawi nila yung kanilang endorsement of that deal. Kasi ang buod nito ay 90% ng Malampaya ay pinagmamay-ari na ng Udena Corporation ni Dennis Uy na isang crony ni Duterte. And merong mga haka-haka lang naman na dahil meron na silang previous partnership with a Chinese oil extracting company, ay baka pag-interestan nila yung other reserves of natural gas around Malampaya kasi paubos na yung supply ng Malampaya by 2027. So merong nakaamba na energy crisis in Luzon, pero meron pang possible na oil resources or natural gas resources around Malampaya na pwedeng ikonekta sa Malampaya facility, and then ito yung pagkakitaan ng kumpanya ni Dennis Uy. So may ganong klaseng cronyism na nakapalibot doon sa Malampaya deal. Pero it's an ongoing story kasi for example yung government corporation nga na yun ay parang binabawi niya yung support doon sa ganong klaseng deal. So let's see what will happen there.
We're coming in out of a pandemic. Private sector activity is very low. Government, we are now at a milestone. We are going to be changing governments, cabinets, lahat. Ang dami ng kailangang mag-iba. If you were in government, parang pag tumingin ka sa mahiwagang salamin, very Boyabunda, na naman ako.
Boyabunda.
No, I mean, if you were in a position to influence or do something about the economy, what would be your focus area?
Basically muna kung ano yung hindi ginagawa ng current government. Basically ang priority talaga natin ngayon ay makarecover ng mabilis yung ating ekonomiya. At pero kailangan natin mag-focus sa health system kasi yung pandemic sinasabi magiging endemic siya. It will be always with us. So we have to make sure that the economy is resilient when it comes to COVID. So buhusan natin ng resources yung mga ospital, yung testing, contact tracing, and then yung bakuna. And kasi hindi ka makaka-expect ng maayos na recovery ng ekonomiya mo kung takot pa rin yung mga tao na lumabas. For example, because of the Omicron variant, di ba? Nakaamba na naman, may threat na naman dun sa paglabas ng mga tao sa ekonomiya. So, kailangan confident pa rin yung mga tao na kahit may Omicron variant ay protektado yung mga tao with the vaccines, with sufficient testing, contact tracing. So, I think that's the first priority. The second will be to give aid to the poor as well as small businesses na nagsara. Kasi 99% ng mga negosyo sa Pilipinas muna ay small and medium enterprises and micro enterprises. Marami sa kanila nadapa. And importante sila dahil they employ a majority of our workers in the labor force, pero maraming hindi nakatanggap ng ayuda. Many of them will be having difficulties recovering or standing on their feet as the economy opens up. So kailangan mabigyan sila ng ayuda ASAP. And I think number 3, I think kailangan nating ibalik yung tiwala ng mga tao sa gobyerno, yung trust doon sa institutions, especially yung mga nasirang institutions in the past few years. I think that will be crucial kasi nakita natin muna good governance really matters when it comes to the welfare of our people, and the pandemic has exemplified that. So I think kailangan na talaga natin, napaka-crucial nung election natin. Hopefully talaga hindi tayo makabalik sa masamang panahon.
Oo. And yun nga I actually agree with you na before we can move the economy forward, talagang yung health kailangang ma-address Dapat,
correct.
Actually, nung sinabi mo, yung mga taong hindi lumalabas, ako yun. Hindi ako lumalabas ng bahay. Ikaw
pala.
Dahil hindi ako lumalabas ng bahay. Pero not everybody has the ability to do that. So talagang, this health crisis must, what's the word? We must get through it, na talagang ma-institutionalize yung what we need to do as a country to make sure na hindi lumala yung sitwasyon. And I also agree with your point about the private sector and the small, medium-scale industries. Doon kasi yung karamihan. Alam ko na importante sa atin yung mga malalaking industries, pero karamihan sa atin talagang maliliit na negosyo ang pinagtatrabahuhan or tayo mismo ang may mga negosyo, di ba? So, tama. Sana this is going to be a better year for all of us kasi that's the only thing we can hope for. So I think that's it. I took so much of your time tonight, JC, but I really enjoyed having this conversation with you.
I did as well. Thank you so much, Mona.
Follow niyo si JC. Follow niyo si JC sa TikTok.
Dadalasan ko na sa TikTok. Dadalasan ko na. May ring light na ako.
Diba? Balita ko nung early TikToks mo, dami mong TikTok.
Oo nga eh. Parang oras kong ginagawa dapat yung 1-minute video.
Dapat panindigan mo na yun.
Oo nga, sige. Sisipagan ko na. Na-inspire ako sa iyo, Mona eh.
Ganun. Thank you so much, JC, and I thank you for all of the love that you guys gave us. You know, it was such a fun conversation.
Pretty good.
You, JC.
Thank you, Mona. Sa uulitin.
And share the link to your study on your TikTok kasi I think that's something that people should read.
Yes,
tsaka, that's also another thing na sana people do more of. Read. Kasi masyadong marami tayong minsang we just trust video. I know that
actually
this format is fun. The platform short video format is fun. Pero minsan magbasa naman tayo. Diba?
Huwag gawing substitute ang TikTok videos sa primary sources and studies.
Oo, sa totoo lang. Ayan, sa Miss Kit, lagi humihingi na. Miss Kit, I can send it to you also. I will share that with you. So, ayun. And para rin si Sir JC, dapat magkaroon siya ng 1,000 followers. So, lahat ng mga girlfriend ngayon, ipakipromote na si JC. Yan po ang aking si JC. Kanyang talent agent. Follow JC sa 1,000 likes so he can also do his own TikTok live. O, diba?
I-Gcash ko na lang muna yung professional fee mo as my agent.
O, diba? Meow meow.